There's JP.
Hi!
There's JP.
Justice for Micah!
A standoff with protesters, an arrest by local police, an FBI raid on his house. John Paul Miller can't seem to escape the spotlight after the death of his young wife, Micah Miller, back in April. We have got our hands on an incident report which goes into further detail about his arrest for allegedly assaulting a woman in a parking lot. Let's talk about John Paul Miller, the South Carolina pastor who really made national headlines after he abruptly announced that his wife, Micah, died. And he announced it at the end of a sermon earlier this year. And she had died, as we know, by suicide at a state park in nearby North Carolina. Micah had served as a worship leader at Solid Rock Church in Myrtle Beach. She was beloved by the congregation. Now, there was immediate suspicion from the community and Micah's family that John Paul might have had something to do with her death. Either direct involvement, which doesn't make any sense because authorities confirmed he was hundreds of miles away in Charleston when she died, or maybe even indirect abuse that led to Micah taking her own life. Now, John Paul, to be clear, has maintained not only that he had nothing to do with this, but he's maintained that Micah was struggling with mental health and alleges that she stopped taking her medication. He has repeatedly denied any sort of abuse or wrongdoing against his wife. And on the day of her death, we know that Micah was seen on surveillance video purchasing a gun at a pawn shop before driving to Lumber River State Park, and autopsy results confirmed that she died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Now, despite that determination from officials and despite John Paul never having been charged in connection with Micah's death, some in the community want more answers. There is this grassroots campaign that is beginning a lot of traction. On Sundays since her death, protesters have chanted and held signs outside of the Solid Rock Church that said, "Justice for Micah." Protesters also showed up to John Paul's home when FBI agents searched it at the beginning of November. Now, no information has been released about what the agents might have been looking for, or what they actually found, or what they took from the home. It's also unclear if the search had anything to do with Micah's death. Having said that, attorney Regina Ward, who actually worked with Micah before her death in order to help her file divorce papers against John Paul, she was apparently outside the home as the FBI conducted that search. And we spoke with her to find out about what she knows about that investigation.
Back in June, I was served with a grand jury from the United States District Court, asking for all of my materials, my file documents, and everything that I had in my possession that was related to Micah. As far as page 2 of that subpoena, well, first of all, they subpoenaed me to come down to Florence to testify before the grand jury. And they gave me an option to produce the documents and those types of things and directly to the assigned one of the assigned special FBI agents. So attached to that subpoena is a list of specific things that they wanted me to supply them with, and in that list, it specified particular things or events. I would say types of crimes that it might be related to, which obviously I cannot disclose, period, because whenever you're investigating someone, for a crime, you give them a heads up what you're coming after, then there's going to be, they have the opportunity to dispose of certain evidence. So we certainly don't want to jeopardize any sort of investigation with regard to that. As to what's going to happen next, well, that's pretty straightforward. It's going to take a little while for the FBI to get through, everything that they took out of there. But the next step is going to be that indictment, that arrest. That's what's going to happen next. Is it going to happen this month? Probably not. Next month? Probably not. Do I know specifically what day it's going to happen? No, I don't even think the FBI does now. They have to stack up enough evidence to go back to the magistrate and say, oh, thank you so much for that search warrant. Now we would like to get an arrest warrant. So they put all of that together. That's what's happening now.
Now, according to Russell Long, this is John Paul's attorney, his client has had to hide to avoid people who are harassing him, and says that the protests, quote, killed the church. And earlier this month, he said Solid Rock Church shut down. And now that brings us to the altercation that we want to talk about between John Paul Miller and a protester that was caught on video. Okay, so to talk more about this, I want to bring on South Carolina criminal defense attorney Chris Adams. Chris, thanks so much for coming on here. Have you been following this story, this saga that is John Paul Miller?
I have. I'm in Charleston, and Myrtle Beach is about 2 hours north. It's a huge story in Myrtle Beach. It's known around the state. People are following it around the state.
Well, I want to get in specifically to this physical altercation that happened. So let's go back to November 6th. And this is when items were being removed from this church. And there were these protesters there. And some of them started filming what was happening. And one of those protesters was Sandra Karen, who ended up following John Paul Miller in the parking lot. She told the local affiliate that John Paul actually squared up to her, tapped her on the hat with his phone, and video of that confrontation was posted on social media. Uh-oh, y'all. What's going on? Now, police were called, but John Paul wasn't immediately arrested. Authorities caught up to him a little bit later on. And according to an arrest report from the Myrtle Beach Police Department, John Paul was picked up on a warrant by Horry County Police, taken to Myrtle Beach Jail. He was charged with third-degree assault and battery, which is a misdemeanor. He was released on bond the next day, November 7th, on a bond of $776. He's due back in court in December. But talking a little bit more about this, after John Paul was released, his attorney released a statement or said, the bigger problem is this group of people won't leave him alone. They will not. They've driven the church to death, and they're trying to drive him to death and begging the city to help. They won't do anything for him. He has nowhere to turn. Well, now we have this incident report from Myrtle Beach Police, and it definitely gives us new insight into what Sandra Karen says happened. So it states, quote, she states that while she was on the sidewalk in front of Solid Rock Church, she observed the offender recording them from behind protesters' vehicles in the parking lot. She then went across the street to confront him. She stated that she called out to the offender to ask what he was doing. The offender walked away, but she called back out to him, and then the offender came back and met her in between two vehicles where words were exchanged, and the victim said the offender began recording her. Now, Chris, objectively, it certainly seems like Sandra Karen was the aggressor here, right? Running over to John Paul, following him in the parking lot. Does this hurt the assault claim?
It does. I mean, you are entitled to defend yourself. And there's also a stand the ground law in South Carolina where if you're at your workplace and there's anyone who's committing any sort of assault at you or coming in unprovoked, you're able to defend yourself and act upon appearances. What
would be a good explanation for her to come up to him, right? Because it just seems like she's not connected to this case. It almost seems like she's harassing him.
Well, she's in a public space in the parking lot, and she's, unless they were trespassing, but I believe they were in a public space, and we all have a First Amendment right to approach people. That doesn't mean any person has to assume people are coming up to wish them a good day or to not cause them any sort of harm. So if he believed that she was there to inflict violence on him in any way, to push him, to shove him, he would be entitled to respond appropriately to defend himself.
Let's expand upon this a little bit more, because going back to this incident report, it reads, while the offender was holding the phone up to her face, the victim said the offender asked her, "What you gonna do?" and tapped the bill of her hat 2 times and walked away, after which the victim yelled at the offender, "Don't you touch me," multiple times. Now, a couple things to break down from that. First of all, she says he tapped her hat 2 times, just 1 time, and maybe you could say it was a slip of the hand. 2 times, Chris, that feels more deliberate, right?
It does. For there to be an assault and battery, there has to be an unlawful touching. And in theory, you could touch a hat of somebody and that could be an unlawful touching. However, we really, as a general matter in criminal law, we want to have some restraint on charges, and we only want to charge when people have clearly violated the law. I've been bumped into numerous times. You've been bumped into. We all get bumped into. If you've ever been in the subway, you've been bumped into. At the grocery store, you get bumped into. Those are not assaults. A touching of a cap, it might very well be a jury question on whether that would constitute an assault or not.
But it could be an article of your clothing. It doesn't have to be the actual body. It could be something connected to the body.
Correct.
Yeah. I guess part of me wonders, is this the kind of case we're really going to go to a jury for?
Well, so in a magistrate court setting, you'd be entitled, if you're charged with an offense in South Carolina, entitled to a 6-pack jury, 6 jurors in the box. And they would be 6 people unassociated with the case, so they're not protesting. They are supporting Micah, and they're not believing that he's guilty of something bigger. And it would be isolated to whether a touching of a brim, if somebody approaches you and you tap them on the brim and walk away, if that would constitute an assault. I would think that it wouldn't. And I would hope that the prosecutors would err on the side of not pursuing the case.
By the way, so much of what we do today is recorded. I mean, if you go on social media, you see kinds of face-offs like this happening all the time. And, we complain about people having their phones all the time, recording everything. This could prove to be a very important piece of evidence. It's captured, or some of it's captured, on videotape. How important do you think that video is going to be?
I think that will be more important than anything else. And I think one of the news crews was on the scene, and they have footage also of the incident. I think it'd be very important. But going back to the bigger question, I mean, I grew up watching baseball in the 1970s, and Billy Martin was a famous manager of the Yankees, and he would come out and kick dirt on umpires and bump their chest pads routinely. And he was the most colorful character in Major League Baseball. That would have been a more violent interaction than tapping a cap and walking away of somebody who has come over and jumped in your face.
Right. Right. And I actually want to go back to the incident report because there's some more to it that we have to break down. So it talks about witness one. And it says that witness one was on scene and observed the incident from a close distance and stated the offender was called out by the victim, observed the offender tap the victim's hat 2 times. Witness two pointed out and identified the offender in the parking lot and observed the incident from a further distance. She was on the opposite side of the street from the incident location. Written statements were taken from the victim and 2 witnesses and turned over to detectives. No charges were made while the scene on the investigation will be ongoing. Chris, talk to me about those witnesses and what we should be making of that.
One question for any witness is do they have a bias? Do they have the ability to see what they're claiming they see clearly? Do they see the entire scope of the action? And also, why is the witness there? Is the witness there to protest and to make life uncomfortable for Mr. Miller, or are they there simply walking past or parking their car to go somewhere else? In this situation, it appears that everyone has a bias. Mr. Miller is telling people he's not responsible for the death of his wife, and he's upset that his church is being protested and he is being protested and the subject of investigation. And the protest group is there with a clear bias against Mr. Miller. They're trying to stir up and gain attention so that the police will continue investigating to see if they can't charge him somehow with the death of Micah. Facts underneath sort of why a person is there is just naturally going to shape their perspective of what occurred.
And talking about that, John Paul has filed restraining orders against the Justice for Micah protesters. In fact, according to his attorney, Russell Long, at least 2 of those have been granted. And those restraining orders, according to Long, are against a man named Jan Lancaster, who posts on social media, and James J. Bingham Jr., who regularly protests and usually dresses up as Jesus. According to Long, Lancaster allegedly said that if John Paul did an interview with him, he'd leave him alone. Now, John Paul's attorneys say it's quid pro quo. Essentially, Lancaster told local media that he plans to appeal it. Bingham said the same. And this isn't the first time that there's been a confrontation between Micah supporters and members of Solid Rock. If you know about this case, you remember that 67-year-old church member Robert Loschel was arrested over the summer after he sprayed multiple protesters in the face with water from a sprinkler. He was charged with 3rd-degree assault. So aside from what is a really distressing situation here, Chris, John Paul getting restraining orders against people, does that help him in the current case? Does that help him in any way?
I believe it would help him. There would not be a restraining order against the woman who's filing this complaint. But if she's part of a group, it would show that he was taking it seriously. He was taking all the steps that he needed to take lawfully to not be harassed or approached by people who might be intending to do him harm. And again, you can act on appearances. If you're walking away from a group and somebody races over and gets in your face and starts raising their voice, you don't have to jump to the conclusion that they're just going to raise their voice at you. There might be every reason for him to believe hands were about to be placed on him or he was about to be punched. And keep in mind the context of this, Jesse, is I believe this came right after it became known that the FBI had raided his house. They'd come into his house and cleared out the computer equipment. And then this protest was within a day or 2 after that incident. So the protesters, in all likelihood, would have been jacked up. And if they saw their target, it's hard to know what a reasonable person in his shoes might expect.
And he's also probably highly emotional and maybe triggered as well with everything going on. So just a weird little story to what is also a very bizarre and distressing story nonetheless. But Chris Adams, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. And thanks for giving us a little bit of insight into South Carolina law. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.